wabarakatuh. Hello, my name is Puja Ananda Maratu Salihah and my student number is 19320046. And I'm from DK class in the 4th semester, and I am one of the members of group 3. And my other members is Tio Irawan, and Vena Angelita. And we are going to presentation our material about relative clauses as modifiers of nouns and integrated versus supplementary relatives. First, what are relative clauses? A relative clause is a special kind of subordinate clause whose primary function is as modifier to a noun or nominal. Subordinate clause which allow us to add information about people or things we're talking to without need to repeat the name. For the example, that is the house. The house was built in the main road. It's changing because that is the house which was built in the main road. So which here still refer to the house. 1. Relative clauses as modifiers of nouns. Look at for the examples here. The secretary wrote to all the members who were absent from the meeting. And the second is the film which I needed is unobtainable. So the underlined relative clause here modifies members and combine with it to form the head nominal of the predicated noun phrase. Similarly, in the second example, the relative clause here modifies film, and film which I needed here forms the head nominal that is determined by the. Relative clauses are introduced just after the antecedent and are introduced by pronoun or a relative adverb. The most frequent ones are who, whom, which, or that, only in defining relative clauses, and relative adverbs like where, when, or why. The relation between a pronoun and its antecedent is called anaphora, and it is a crucial property of relative clauses that they always contains an element that is anaphorically related to an antecedent. In order to draw attention to this essential feature of relative clauses, which distinguishes them from other kinds of finite subordinate clause, we will use the symbol "or" for the element in them that is anaphorically related to an antecedent. For the previous example, the second there, the film which I needed is unobtainable. We have I needed "are." The antecedent is film, so I needed some film, and this film is unobtainable. The way this feature distinguishes relative clauses from content clauses is illustrated here. For the example illustrated in this example, for the relative clause is they rejected the suggestion which your son made, and the content clause is they rejected the suggestion that your son was lying. So we understand that here your son made suggestion and they rejected. And for the content clause, you know that there is no anaphora, there is no link, anaphoric link to the head suggestion here. So your son was lying is the content of the suggestion here. WH and non-WH relative clauses. The relative clauses that do contain an overt anaphora link like who or which are called WH relatives. Here are others that don't, and they are the non-WH relative. Look at for the example here. Example for WH relative is the film which I needed is not obtainable. And for the non-WH, there is two kinds, that relative and real relative. The example is the film that I needed is not obtainable, and the film I needed is not obtainable. The non-WH relative with the subordinator that are called that relatives, and this where the subordinator is omitted are called their relatives. Although need is transitive and has to have an object in canonical clauses, here we cannot add an overt object for it. For the example here, the feeling that I needed more time was not obtainable. So, non-phrase more time has been added as a direct object, but it makes the sentence just isn't overt in the but it makes the sentence ungrammatical. Why? Because needed has already got a direct object. It just isn't overt in this relative clauses construction. The relativized element. The overt or covert element are that is anaphorically linked to the head noun is called the relativized element. It can have a range of functions within the relative class, where we use WH relatives because the relativized element is overt. Regard for this example. Subject, some friends who saw her. For object, a key which she found. For the complement of preposition, those books which I referred to, and etc. Notice the different words beginning with WH that are used here. Who, for people, which, for things, when, for times, where, for places, and why, for the reasons. Non-WH counterpart of the WH relatives in previously are shown here. The notation underscores, like this, marks the position of the covered R element. Again means here, like before, this notation, same notation, and the example is subject. For the subject, some friend that saw her. For the object, a key that she found. For the complement of preposition, those books that I referred to. The non-WH construction is not always available when the relativized element is adjunct or complement. The adjunct or complement of place, like the example number 5, with the head noun a place, it's perfectly acceptable, but in sentences with head nouns less likely to suggest location. Like a place that you can relax, it's like you give suggestion to someone that place can make you relax. So a WH relative would normally be required in here. Okay, thank you. My friends, we will continue my presentation and thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Vena Angelita. I want to presenting about R element within an embedded clause. It is possible for the R element to be located within a content clause embedded inside the relative clause. This is the example first. A K which he says she found, and B a K that he says she found ... And the example 2, A some boys who he says saw her, and B some boys that he says ... saw her. And in I, R is subject of found, and the found clause is a content clause functioning as complement of says. He says she found R. We understand that he says she found some key, and that's the key the whole noun phrase refers to. In example 2, R is subject of the embedded saw clause. He says R saw her. Note that that is omissible in example 2. This different from example first. Above and that the R element is subject not of the relative clause itself, but of the content clause embedded within it. And next is the relative phrase. Example number 1. She hasn't been able to contact the people whose house she's renting. Example 2. This is the article from which they were quoting. The bold underlined expression here contain not just the relative pronouns whose and which. We need therefore to distinguish between two concepts. First concept is the relative phrase. It means the constituent occupying initial position in the clause. And example 2, the relative element, the element that is unapologetically related to the head noun, the element we have been representing as R. I want to explain about the example first. In example 1, for example, it is just whose, not whose house, that has people as its antecedents. We can represent the clause as she's renting R's house. With R unapologetically related to people, we understand that she is renting some people's house and she hasn't been able to contact these people. Similarly, in example 2, the head nouns, article, and problem are antecedents just for the pronoun which we have for 2. They were quoting from R. The answer to some problem can be found in the textbook, and he sent us this problem. And next is integrated versus supplementary relatives. The relatives clause considered so far have all been tightly integrated into the structure of the noun phrase containing them. As such, they contrast with another kind of relative clause that is more loosely attached. This second kind we call supplementary relative clause. These examples illustrate the contrast. First is integrated. Politicians who make extravagant promises aren't trusted. And supplementary. Politicians who make extravagant promises aren't trusted. In this section, we'll look in detail at the differences between integrated and supplementary relative with respect to 3 things. First is intonation and the punctuation. B is interpretation and C is syntax. I want to explain about the intonation and punctuation. Intonation and punctuation. Integrated relatives are integrated intonationally into the larger construction. Supplementary ones are set apart, spoken as a separate intonation unit. In writing, this difference is reflected in the punctuation with supplementary relatives generally marked off by commas, or stronger punctuation such as dases or parentheses, as seen in example 2. Punctuation does not provide quite as reliable a criterion as intonation. However, because we do find relatives which are clearly supplementary but are written without being set apart by punctuation.
Okay, I will continue the explanation from my friend. Our topic is interpretation. The name we have given to the two types of relative clause directly reflect the difference in meaning. The information expressed in an integrated relative is presented as integral part of the relative message. The information expressed in a supplementary relative is present as supplementary to that expressed in the rest of the sentence. It is additional, often parenthetical, and material. On the basis of the kind of contrast, the two types of relative clause are traditionally called restrictive or sometimes deafening, and non-restrictive or non-deafening respectively. We don't use this term because they are misleading. The integrated relative is not always restrictive, in the sense of picking out a subset of the set denoted by the head noun. Take this example. The first example, Martha has two sons who are still at school and two who are at university. And the second example, Martha has two sons she can rely on, and Hen is only worried. In the first example, the relative clause certainly are semantically restrictive. There they distinguish two sets of sons. Evidently, Martha has at least 4 in all. In the second example, however, there is no restriction. There is no implication that Martha has more than 2 sons. The information given in the relative clause does not distinguish these 2 sons from any other son that she might have. But it presented as integral part of the relative message. Another reason for presenting it as such as this essential to explanation why she was not only worried. Having 2 sons doesn't necessarily keep a mother from worrying, but being able to rely on them does. Okay, now we continue our topic about syntax. In addition to what we have just set out concerning the phonological or punctuational and semantic fact about integrated and supplementary relative, there are also a number of syntactic differences. We will mention 4. The first is WH relative versus non-WH relative. Supplementary relative are almost always of the WH relative type. The bare construction is not allowed at all as a supplementary relative, and supplementary relative that relative are extremely rare and really only marginally present in standard English. The second, the antecedent allowed for supplementary. The supplementary relative allow a wider range antecedent than integrated one. Most important, they accept clause and proper noun without determiner, as in the example. The first example makes revelate with child some delight, and the second example, Max, who was usually very punctual, was 20 minutes late. In the first example, the antecedent of which is the preceding clause. In our representation, R shows some delight. The R is interpreted as Max arriving late. And the second and the second example, the antecedent of how is Meg. We understand that Max was usually very punctual. Proper noun normally assure with integrated relative only if there is a determiner, as in he is not the Max I was referring to. Okay, next. The third is which as pronoun or determinative. Which assure in integrated relative only as a pronoun, but in supplementary relative it can also be a determinative. For the example, this will keep us busy until Friday. By which time the boss will be back. Note that here the relative element is which time, not which alone. It is this element that derives its interpretation from the antecedent Friday. And the last is function. Integrated relative function as dependent, more specifically modifier within the contraction containing them, but supplementary relative are attacked more loosely and in that may constitute a separated clause, as in 50 example, where again which has clause as in antecedent. Look the example. A. Our rent is due next week, and B. Which is why we should not be going out in dinner tonight. And okay, that's all from us. Thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.